When Javier Mendoza, 36, heir to a hotel empire worth over 200 million euros, decided to dress up as a chauffeur for a day to surprise his fiancée Valentina with a romantic ride through Madrid, he never imagined that this seemingly innocent gesture would shatter his heart and save his life at the same time. What began as a romantic idea became the most painful and revealing experience of his life. Believing he was just another employee, the three women sitting in the back seat began to speak about him with brutal honesty. And what Javier heard during that 40-minute ride, while pretending to be invisible behind the wheel, didn't just break his heart, it opened his eyes to a truth he had been denying for 2 years. The woman he planned to marry in 3 months had never truly loved him. She only loved his money, his last name, and the lifestyle he represented. And as he drove through the streets of Madrid, listening to every venomous word, every cruel laugh, every devastating revelation, Javier had to make the greatest effort of his life not to stop the car and confront them right then and there, because sometimes the most painful truth is also the most necessary one. If you're ready for this story, write where you're watching this video from. Javier Mendoza had been born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but that didn't mean his life had been easy. At 36, he was the sole heir to the Mendoza Group, a chain of luxury hotels his grandfather had founded in the 1950s, which now spanned 20 properties across Spain, France, and Italy. His father had died of a heart attack when Javier was 23, leaving him at the helm of an empire he barely understood. He still remembered that terrible moment. The midnight call, the rush to the hospital, arriving too late to say goodbye. The last 13 years had been a brutal learning roller coaster. He had matured under pressure, transforming from an idealistic young man who dreamed of being an architect into a pragmatic businessman making decisions that affected thousands of families. The sleepless nights reviewing financial statements, the endless meetings with executives questioning his every decision, the constant pressure of keeping a family legacy afloat. He had sacrificed his personal life, his friends who stopped calling when he was never available, his passions that withered under the weight of responsibility. Romantic relationships had been especially difficult. A painful parade of women who either wanted him for his money or were intimidated by his last name and the social chasm it represented. Until he met Valentina Ruiz 2 years ago at a charity gala at the Ritz Hotel. She seemed different. Refreshingly different. 32 years old, elegant without being pretentious, cultured without being pedantic. She worked as an event coordinator for a luxury brand. She didn't seem impressed by his wealth when they were introduced. She didn't ask the typical questions about his hotels or his fortune. She was discreet, intelligent in conversation about contemporary art and Latin American literature, beautiful without being flashy in her simple but perfectly cut navy blue dress. Javier fell head over heels, feeling for the first time in years that flutter in his chest he thought he had lost forever. For the first 6 months, everything was perfect, like a carefully constructed dream. Valentina was attentive without being clingy, affectionate without being demanding. She seemed genuinely interested in him as a person, not as a bank account. They shared similar tastes in jazz music and French cinema. Conversations flowed naturally into the early morning hours. Javier felt he had finally found someone who loved him for who he was at his core, not for what he represented or possessed. But slowly, almost imperceptibly like fog creeping through a valley, things began to change. Valentina started making subtle comments about expensive places she wanted to go, jewelry she had seen in shop windows, exotic trips she dreamed of taking. Nothing too obvious at first, always wrapped in casual phrases, but Javier began to notice a disturbing pattern. Whenever he mentioned working on a weekend or staying in to watch movies, she showed barely concealed disappointment, hidden behind a forced smile. Every time they went out, she insisted on the most exclusive restaurants, the ones requiring reservations months in advance, and the most luxurious stores on Serrano Street, where a scarf cost more than the monthly salary of many of his employees. Javier convinced himself her love was real, that the material gestures were just extras, superficial adornments that didn't define their relationship. He told himself Valentina simply appreciated beautiful things, that she had grown up with fewer resources and now enjoyed having access to certain luxuries. When he proposed to her 6 months ago in Paris, on the terrace of the Hotel George V with a view of the Eiffel Tower lit up like a beacon of hope, she cried tears of happiness under the Parisian stars. The wedding preparations turned into a Hollywood-scale production that grew more out of control each day. The original budget of €100,000, which already seemed excessive, had tripled without Javier being able to explain exactly how. Every time he suggested something more modest or intimate, she would get upset with arguments that sounded reasonable in the moment. And Javier gave in, again and again, because he loved her, or believed he did, because he wanted to make her happy, because he naively thought the details didn't matter as long as they were together building a future. But deep down, in that place where uncomfortable truths hide, a small voice whispered doubts that grew a little louder each day. A voice Javier desperately ignored because confronting it would mean admitting he might have made a terrible mistake, that he might be repeating the pattern of so many failed relationships before. That voice was about to become a deafening scream he could no longer ignore. The idea of disguising himself as a chauffeur came about almost by accident, one of those sudden whims that changes the course of a life. It was Friday morning, and Javier was reviewing contracts in his office when Valentina called in her cheerful voice. She and her 2 best friends, Patricia and Carmen, wanted to go shopping in downtown Madrid. Miguel, his usual chauffeur and a family confidant for 2 decades, had taken the day off because his grandson's birthday. Javier had a sudden idea that, in the moment, seemed romantic and spontaneous. He could drive them himself. He'd put on casual clothes, a cap, sunglasses. It would be fun, romantic, a little innocent game between fiancés. He could observe Valentina in her natural element, listen to her conversations with her friends without the filter she always put up when she was with him. See that authentic side of her she didn't show when they were alone. It seemed like a sweet, mischievous way to know her better before marriage. He had no idea he was about to witness his own Greek tragedy, that this simple disguise would tear the veil from his life and reveal a truth that would shatter him. Javier dressed carefully that afternoon. Simple black pants, a plain white shirt without a monogram, a driver's jacket he had bought years ago for a costume party. He put on a Real Madrid baseball cap that hid part of his face and dark sunglasses. He looked in the mirror and barely recognized himself. He looked like any private chauffeur in Madrid, anonymous, invisible. The transformation was surprisingly complete. He called Valentina from an unknown number, using a more formal voice. He introduced himself as Miguel's substitute. Valentina didn't even ask his name, just gave the address in the Salamanca district where he was to pick them up at 5 p.m. At 5 p.m. sharp, he parked the black Mercedes in front of the luxury building. The 3 women came out laughing, loaded with designer shopping bags. Valentina wore the Chanel dress he had given her, Louboutin shoes, the Hermès bag that had cost a fortune. Javier got out to open the door for them, keeping his head down. None of them really looked at him. To them, he was just staff, invisible as air. 5 minutes later, they picked up Carmen in the Chambéry district. Carmen was the loudest of the group, platinum blonde with obvious extensions, heavy makeup. Javier had never liked her, but he tolerated her because Valentina insisted she was her best friend. Once they were settled in the back seat, Javier asked in a neutral voice where they wanted to go. Valentina answered without looking at him, the Golden Mile. Javier nodded silently and began to drive. The first 5 minutes were trivial conversation. They commented on the light traffic, the summer heat, a celebrity Patricia had seen. Javier breathed easy, even smiling under his cap. This is going to be fun, he thought. A little secret he'd share with Valentina later. Then Carmen said something that froze Javier's blood. She casually remarked that there were only 3 months left until Valentina married the ATM. All 3 women burst into laughter. Javier felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. But he kept his face neutral, his eyes on the road. Maybe he had misheard. Valentina stopped laughing and sighed theatrically. She confessed she was more relieved than nervous. 2 years pretending to care about Javier's boring stories about hotels and management. She joked about how many times she'd had to fake orgasms, that she should win an acting award. Javier's world stopped. The noise of traffic faded. The only thing he could hear was the voice of the woman he loved describing him as if he were a tedious job to be endured. Patricia chimed in, saying at least he was handsome and pretty good in bed, according to what Valentina had told her. It could be worse, she said. Valentina agreed. She admitted Javier was attractive and the sex was acceptable, but outside the bedroom he was so predictable, so boring, all work and no spontaneity. Like being engaged to a 50-year-old accountant trapped in a 36-year-old's body. Carmen clapped with enthusiasm. She reasoned, who needs spontaneity when you have unlimited access to credit cards? When Valentina married, she'd have to endure boring conversations, sure, but every boring dinner was a Cartier, every weekend at home was a trip to the Maldives. It was like a job, but the salary was incredible. The three laughed again. Javier drove like an automaton while his brain tried to process what he was hearing. This had to be a nightmare, but he didn't wake up, and they kept talking. Valentina lowered her voice, sharing a delicious secret. The night before, Javier had mentioned a prenuptial agreement, standard procedure in his family. Patricia asked how she had reacted. Valentina described the perfect scene she had staged, tears, trembling voice, a full performance. She had told him she was hurt, that she thought he trusted her. The fool had apologized. He had said she was right, that there would be no prenup. Then they'd had the best make-up sex. It was almost too easy, she concluded with satisfaction. Carmen congratulated her in admiration. You're a master. You should teach a class, basic course on how to marry a millionaire. Javier felt nauseous. He wanted to stop, turn around, scream at them. But something held him back, a masochistic need to hear everything, to know the complete truth, no matter how much it hurt. And it hurt like nothing had ever hurt before. Patricia, who had been relatively quiet until now, spoke in a more serious tone. She wanted to make sure Valentina wasn't planning to leave him after a year and end up with nothing. She had to be smart about it. Valentina sighed as if explaining something obvious. She already had a complete plan. The first 5 years, she would be the perfect wife, smile for photos, attend boring events, pretend interest in his charity foundation. She would give him at least 2 children, because that ensured more money in the divorce. 3 if she could stand it. Javier felt something break inside him. They had talked about children with so much emotion, and she had seen them only as a financial strategy. Carmen interjected with morbid curiosity, asking about that lawyer she was seeing. Rodrigo, I think his name was. Javier's world tilted dangerously. An affair. Valentina laughed. Rodrigo was a nice distraction. They saw each other when Javier was on business trips. He was exciting, passionate, everything Javier wasn't. But Rodrigo was poor. He lived in a shared apartment, perfect for now, but no future. When she married, she'd have to drop him. Well, at least for the first few years. After the divorce, who knows? Patricia sounded worried. What if Javier finds out about Rodrigo? Valentina didn't seem concerned at all. Javier was so trusting, so naive, he'd never suspect. And his own employees adored her because she gave them generous tips, with his money. Miguel, his chauffeur, covered for her all the time when she needed to make up excuses. All the employees looked the other way because she treated them well. Javier was completely in the dark. The betrayal multiplied, spreading like an ink stain in water. Miguel, the man he trusted like an uncle. Everyone knew. Carmen applauded in admiration. Honestly, Valentina, you're my hero. I tried the same thing with a businessman last year, but he caught me Googling how much he was worth. You've played this perfectly from the beginning. Valentina accepted the compliment with false modesty. I had a good teacher, my mother. She did exactly the same thing with my stepfather. Pretended to love him for 10 years, had 3 kids, and in the divorce got half of everything plus lifelong alimony. Now she lives in Marbella without working. She taught me that romantic love is for the poor and the foolish. Real love is financial security. And that's what I'm going to get from Javier Mendoza. The words floated in the car like invisible poison. Every happy memory with Valentina was destroyed. Every I love you, every intimate moment, all had been an act. Patricia asked a practical question. What about the other people in his life? His friends, his family? Won't they give you away after the divorce? Valentina laughed. Javier doesn't have any real friends. That's the sad part. He sacrificed everything for the business. His friends now are other businessmen. His mother died when he was a child. He has no siblings. His only close relative is an uncle in Argentina he talks to twice a year. Javier Mendoza is the loneliest rich man in Madrid, and I'm going to be the beneficiary of that loneliness. The traffic stopped at a red light. Javier looked in the rearview mirror for the first time. He really looked at Valentina. She was radiant, beautiful, laughing without a hint of guilt on her face. It was like looking at a stranger. The woman he had fallen in love with had never existed. The light turned green. Javier kept driving. The rest of the ride continued in the same vein. The 3 women dissected every detail of the charade. How Valentina had researched everything about Javier before their chance meeting at the Ritz, how she had planned every conversation to seem perfectly compatible, how she had faked interest in architecture because he was passionate about it, how she had pretended to love old movies because he adored them. Every coincidence had been calculated manipulation. When they arrived at the Golden Mile, Javier parked the car, got out, and opened the door with his head bowed. The 3 women got out, chatting animatedly. None of them looked at him. None of them thanked him. To them, he was invisible. Nothing. As they walked away toward the stores, Javier stood by the car, trembling. Not from sadness, though the pain was unbearable, but from rage. This woman had planned to steal years of his life. She had planned to have children with him as pawns in a financial game. But now he knew. And with that knowledge came power. He took off the cap and glasses. He looked at his reflection in the car window. His eyes were red but dry. The tears would come later. Now was the time to act. He took out his phone and called his personal lawyer, Arturo Ramirez, a 60-year-old man who had been a friend of his father's. Half an hour later, he was in his office, telling him everything. Arturo listened in silence, his expression moving from shock to anger. When Javier finished, Arturo leaned back, thoughtful. In a way, that disguise saved you. If you had married without knowing the truth, you would have been tied to her for years. Now you have a chance to escape. Javier wanted to break off the engagement in a way that left her with nothing, not a single euro. Arturo smiled humorlessly. It was more than possible. He had contacts in private investigation who could document the affair with Rodrigo. They could get proof of the conspiracies. With the right evidence, Javier could break off the engagement without consequences. But Javier wanted more. He wanted a confrontation. He wanted to see the look on Valentina's face when she knew she'd been discovered. He wanted her to understand that the man she had underestimated was stronger than she imagined. Arturo sighed but nodded. They were going to give her a lesson she would never forget. 3 days later, Javier had gathered all the evidence. Photographs of Valentina and Rodrigo entering and leaving hotels. Recordings of conspiratorial conversations. Testimonies from horrified employees when they learned the truth. Miguel cried when Javier told him everything, swearing he thought Valentina's absences were innocent surprises. It was Friday night. Javier had organized an intimate dinner at his home. He had told Valentina he wanted to talk about the final wedding details. She arrived radiant, kissing him on the cheek with a false familiarity that now turned his stomach. They sat in the dining room. Javier had dismissed the staff. They were completely alone. Valentina asked what he wanted to talk about. Was there a problem with the catering? Javier interrupted her with a calm but icy voice. There's no problem with the catering. In fact, there won't be a wedding. She blinked, confused. Javier took out his phone and played a recording. Her own words came through the speakers, 2 years faking interest. I should win an acting award. The color drained from Valentina's face. Her eyes widened in horror as the recording continued. When it ended, Javier stared at her. Surprise. The chauffeur that day was me. I heard everything. Every word. Every plan. Every lie. Valentina tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing. Finally, she whispered that they had been joking, that it wasn't what he thought. Javier laughed bitterly. Don't insult me further with lies. I have evidence of everything. Your affair with Rodrigo. Your plans for the divorce. Everything documented. Everything legal. Tears streamed down Valentina's cheeks, but Javier could see they were tears of panic, not remorse. She begged. She said she loved him, that they could overcome this. Javier raised a hand to silence her. You don't love me. You never loved me. And that's okay, because you did me a favor. You showed me who you were before it was too late. Before you had legal access to my money. Before you brought innocent children into your game of manipulation. He stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. He wanted her to leave. Now. Her things would be packed and sent to her. The €150,000 engagement ring she was wearing, he wanted it back. She had 5 seconds before he called security. Valentina stood up, staggering. She pleaded that she had nowhere to go. Javier cut her off. Patricia and Carmen have problems of their own. Our investigators discovered Patricia is embezzling funds at her company. Carmen owes 3 months' rent. Your friends won't be interested in you when you don't have access to my money. Valentina looked at him with pure hatred, finally showing her true face. She called him a bastard. Cruel. Javier didn't flinch. I'm not cruel. I'm fair. You played a dirty game and you lost. Now live with the consequences. Valentina tore off the ring, threw it on the floor, and stormed out, slamming the door. Javier stood in the silence, picked up the ring, and watched it gleam. It had represented his dreams of a future. Now it only represented a painful but necessary lesson. He sat down as the tears finally came. He cried for the lost time, for the betrayed trust. But mixed with the tears was relief. Gratitude. That disguise had saved him from a disaster that would have ruined his life. Months later, Javier was still single, but not alone. He had reconnected with old friends. He had rediscovered abandoned hobbies. He had learned to value himself beyond his bank account. Valentina had disappeared from Madrid. Rodrigo had left her when he found out there was no money. Her friends had abandoned her. The story of the millionaire who disguised himself as a chauffeur became a legend in Madrid. For Javier, it was a reminder that real love isn't bought with money, isn't built on lies, and that sometimes the simplest disguises reveal the most complex truths. A year later, Javier met a woman in a bookstore arguing about Gabriel Garcia Marquez. She was a primary school teacher, earned a modest salary, and had no idea who he was. Her name was Elena. When she found out he was a millionaire 3 months later, her reaction was concern that the money would complicate their relationship, not excitement about material possibilities. That was when Javier knew he had found something real. Because true love doesn't celebrate wealth, it ignores it. True love sees the person, not the bank account. The lesson Valentina had taught him so cruelly turned out to be the most valuable one. that open eyes and a cautious heart aren't cynicism, but hard-won wisdom. And that sometimes, disguising yourself as someone invisible is the only way to see who is really looking at you. If this story has made you reflect on the true value of relationships and the importance of honesty, leave a little heart down below. And if you really want to support stories like this that show truth and justice still matter in this world, consider leaving a super thanks. Every gesture counts, just like Javier's disguise that revealed the truth to him. Because you chose to watch to the end a story that speaks of betrayal but also redemption, of pain but also strength. And that makes you as special as Javier, who had the courage to face a painful truth instead of living a comfortable lie. Because in the end, the truth sets us free, even when it first breaks our heart.